Hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed reading the first week content of our class. As you can already tell, this is a very fascinating topic. We do live in a culture, in a society that is considered to be extremely sex-saturated, but yet there is a big taboo against honest information about human sexuality. If you could just count the number of ads that you've seen on TV pertaining perhaps sexually transmitted infections or condom ads, you may be able to count those with just maybe one hand or with two hands if you've been exposed to many of them. But for the most part, it seems that there isn't a lot of content going around. This may ring the bell to you about Anthony Comstock. This goes back to the 1800s, where individuals that were felt very strongly about blocking some of this content to get to the average household, prohibited the publication of ads that had to do with reproductive health. That included limiting ads of OBGYN and condoms. So we see that even though we're currently in the 21st century, we find that there is still a lot of work to be done in this particular field. When we look at sexuality, as you already know, it's a term that is used exclusively for humans. And we know that sexuality is a very, very multifaceted and multi-layered concept. When we look at other organisms, other species, we refer to them having sexual intercourse, whereas with humans we say that we have sexuality. And the reason why is because sexuality is a general term that has to do not only with a biological principle and physiological responses, but also with feelings and behaviors of human beings concerning sex. We cannot say that every single culture experiences the same feelings, so for that reason we've studied them, and we take not an ethnocentric point of view, that is to say where we only study sexuality in the United States or even California or even Hollywood. As you may already know, there are various parts of our state, in the state of California, that vary in their perception of what may be considered what some may call sexuality within the norm, that is to say adhering to the principles that some may think are appropriate and some may not. So we will do in this next few minutes just a quick review of some of the most important things that you'll need to know of this chapter. I'd like to spend a little bit of time in this first slide of chapter 1. And as we look in here, sexuality is learned from interaction and experiences with friends, romantic partner, religion, culture, society, and primarily from family of origin. It is very important for us to know that our family of origin does shape the way we show our affection to others. I remember being in high school and dating a girl, perhaps in a way that was more serious than I should have for a high school kid. But nonetheless, I met the parents, conservative Mexican household, and one of the things that I would notice is that when they would be in the living room and we would be allowed to watch TV in the living room, we would, when the parents were not looking, hold hands, but yet when the parents would be heard walking in or approaching, it almost felt as though I was being disrespectful to their family if I was holding their daughter's hand. And as I see in here, this really shaped the way I express myself when it comes down to relationships, let alone, of course, our sexuality. When we look at other cultures, this for you may seem, well, that's a bit extreme, that's a bit odd. Nonetheless, when we say we are expressing our sexuality with somebody else, we must keep in mind that unless we are engaging in solitary form of sexuality, which would be a form of masturbation, we are adhering to the culture and family of origin of another individual. Therefore, our emotions, our attitudes, and the way we deal with them, and the way we communicate is of utmost importance. I would also like to point out to you that oftentimes we get a little confused between these two, culture and society. And so we wonder what the difference may be between them. Please keep in mind that our society can actually be changed as a result of a cultural shift or some new trend. When we look at the artist that may be trendy right now, we look at how the individuals are expressing their emotions and their sexuality differently than it was before. Think back to perhaps the oldies music in the 1960s and 70s, where the lyrics were things along the lines of "put your head on my shoulders" and "16 candles," and those were romantic songs. When we look today at our culture that may be inundated by different lyrics that may be a lot more graphic, a lot more aggressive in the sense that they may be expecting and demanding certain things, we could see how our culture, perhaps the culture of young adults, could bring about a shift to our society and to how we may start viewing things perhaps differently. And so, just like that, our culture shifted our society temporarily, but it doesn't mean that it's going to stay there permanently. Perhaps in the next 20 years, there will be a revitalizing or revitalization of music like 16 Candles and Put Your Head on My Shoulders. And we may go back to that. And our society is always shifting. It's just important for us to note, perhaps, that if we are currently in the dating scene, then how would that affect us or benefit us? And if you have kids, then how would that affect or benefit your kids and your family? Please note that human sexuality is grounded in a biological functioning, but it is expressed by the cultural rules that we looked at earlier. And as sexologists seem to investigate sexual behavior throughout the globe, we cannot negate the importance or the impact of media on our expression of that. So we rely on scientists, researchers, clinicians, anthropologists, political scientists, medical doctors, even theologians to understand how it is that we have been impacted by every factor that could be influential. When we look at the media, we wonder what shows like Jersey Shore or Teen Mom or Desperate Housewives and what the impact is that those shows have on gender, sex, and relationships. Have they brought about a shift? And if so, has it been positive or negative? Looking at how teenagers today rely on the internet as a leading source of sex information, it begs to question how valid that information is. And also it begs to question whether children are processing the information with a filter or if they're taking it all at face value. We do know that oftentimes a lot of shows and movies in the movie theater or on TV rely on some sex scene to draw an audience, because we've known throughout history that sex sells. Unfortunately, although there is sexual content in 70% of TV shows, we find that less than 10% of the information there is actually educational. That is to say that it often is just to entertain and amuse individuals and draw them perhaps closer to wanting to explore for themselves. Looking at the evolutionary perspective allows us to understand how human sexuality has changed throughout time. When we look at individuals prior to walking in an upright posture, right when they became quadrupeds, we would see that there was constantly this only method of penetration would be through the rear. This, in various ways, continues to be practiced today, including by developed and evolved organisms. Nonetheless, it didn't seem to really facilitate for a greater intimacy or connection. When we look at individuals who now walk upright, there is now a lot more time and focus on face-to-face intercourse. And while, of course, the preferences of individuals vary from person to person and by culture, of course, we look to see how individuals sometimes become intimate by looking at each other in the eye. This would facilitate it by a particular posture through which individuals can have intercourse looking at each other. This, in addition, would facilitate for the stimulation of the breast and the hips in the females, as well as the male demonstrating the phallus, which has been throughout history a symbol of sex and potency. Even among men, there is this particular fascination with understanding how men seem to really take a lot of pride in this in here. The facilitation or the stimulation of the breast would also allow for these particular organs that are sexual only in humans. That is to say that they're erogenous, and that they, when stimulated, would bring about some sexual arousal. Not to mention that the stimulation of the clitoris would also be easier when facing this particular position or engaging in sexual positions in which individuals are facing each other. When we look at ancient Mediterranean, as you already learned, the Egyptians, the Greek, and the Romans had a lot in different art forms that was left behind. And so we wonder whether these particular pictures and sculptures were a representation of what sex was like in that particular society. It is important for us to know that the depiction of these people was often reserved for those who had financial means and who were of socioeconomic statuses that were typically elevated. Nonetheless, they give us some insight as to what may have been perhaps the fantasy of many. And so when we look at these ancient civilizations in the Mediterranean, we find that they were really ahead of themselves. Many of them would actually engage in making use of contraceptive methods. And the way that they would actually prevent pregnancies from occurring was by putting together different concoctions that would consist of several spices and herbs, and then some of them would even include urine of different animals that they would put into a sponge, and then they would insert it into the vagina either prior to sexual intercourse or thereafter to rinse. And with their limited understanding of how the sperm made its way over to the egg, we would find that they had some type of idea that it needed to be blocked, or if not, then be deactivated through some spices and some herbs. We also find that abortion has been around, but it was typically forbidden because of inheritance purposes. So typically, if it was a male, it was a lot more less common that they would have an abortion if they had some beliefs that it would be a male. And if it was a female, if they believed, because oftentimes they would consult with these individuals that were considered to be intelligent and consult with the stars and with various other forms of religious views, they would be able to foretell what the sex of the individual would be. But keep in mind that this was not foolproof. It's just that because of the faith and customs, individuals would adhere to these mediums or these individuals who would engage in these practices. Also, it was not unusual for them to sometimes terminate the life of an individual shortly after being born. That is to say that it was not necessarily limited to the prenatal stage, but also after the child was born. If they would see that it was a female, it was a lot easier for them to choose to kill the infant female than if it was a male. Prostitution, also considered to be the oldest occupation in history. There were temple prostitutes back in the day, and those were basically women who would have sex with worshippers that would come to these temples. Please keep in mind that going to a temple in these areas of the world before there were cars and airplanes oftentimes consisted of a several-day trip. So men would make their way over to the temple, sometimes leaving behind their wives. And as they would get there, they would be gone sometimes for 2 weeks. It was possibly 7 days going and then 7 days coming back. And being at the temple, sometimes they would get lonely. So temple prostitutes would serve the purpose of providing a sexual favor to these worshippers that had traveled long distances. And one of the ways that they would justify this was by providing money for the temple or to worship the gods. That is to say that whatever money they had made from these transactions, they would then offer as some type of either tithe or offering, and this would somehow make the act a little bit more acceptable. Today, there are still some temple prostitutes in different parts of the world. For example, in India, there are women that are temple prostitutes, and they do not necessarily shy away from that. They're called Devadasi, Devadasi. And these women not only engage in that, but some of them claim that they reached a goddess status because of their sexual abilities and their contributions to the church. As you already know, between the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Romans, there were various levels of acceptability in terms of what they considered the norm for sexual expression. The most conservative of them all were the Hebrews. Then the middle ground would be the Romans, especially if you looked at their practices prior to the 600 AD. And then the most liberal that were often referred to as the freaks are those from Greece. And we find today that they are, even in terms of some studies, the ones that seem to express their sexuality a little bit more freely and more comfortably today. It is important for us to know that pederasty, which is basically an essential rite of passage that every aristocratic Greek boy would go through. And aristocratic, basically those that had the opportunity to go to school. In the Greek community, in the Greek culture, not only was homosexuality institutionalized, that is to say that it was okay to engage in it, but there were several people who would condone that there would be some type of expression between adult men and post-pubescent boys. However, one of Plato's aides in a symposium was asked what was the age of the boys. And although the answer was kind of vague, the historians teach us that the more concrete age was between 14 and 16 years old. But Plato's aide said the following, quote, "A good admirer waits until a boy starts to possess intelligence before loving them." End quote. Very interestingly here, when we look at a good admirer, we're talking about an individual that basically facilitated learning for someone. So these philosophers, Aristotle and Plato and many others, they were the ones that determined when they could love these young boys. And when this particular aide says that they wait until a boy starts to possess intelligence, this is probably not limited to some chronological age. It would have something to do with the perception of the admirer. And when it comes down to this in here, there's a lot of criticism as to why this would occur. But nonetheless, philosophers would often speak in terms of love almost exclusively in homoerotic terms because they would view same-sex love or desire as to be the most pure form of love. They said that men's non-sexual love for another man was seen as the ideal love, even superior to that of sexual love for women. And that is to say that men would be able to stay focused and not give in to lust with another man as easily as they would with another woman. It is also important for us to see the contributions that India has made to our current expression of sexuality. In India, about 400 BC, we looked at how life at the time was not very favorable for females. In fact, being born a female was viewed as a punishment, karma, for sins that were committed in previous lives. So because of this, female infanticide was not unusual. And in fact, many people got away with murdering women because they didn't consider it to be a significant loss. You can imagine how difficult times were for women during this time. But men, nonetheless, also had some type of fascination and interest in preserving life of women because, well, it would serve a purpose of procreation and also recreation. In fact, the Kama Sutra, which is a book that was written by men, Indian men, was considered to be a manual for women. In other words, women had to read this if they wanted to keep their husbands satisfied. And so they would teach them sexual practices, and they would teach about the sex, the nature of love, how to maintain a happy home, family dynamics, and all this so that it would facilitate the life of men. This has been criticized by many to be similar to Fubu. You may remember that brand that was somewhat popular in the late 90s. And Fubu stood for us, by us. And some people have said that this is one of those examples that men would write these books for themselves. That is to say that they would teach women how to be better lovers for their own benefits. And one of the interesting things about the Kama Sutra is that if you've read it, and more so than just looking at pictures, that oftentimes is what people use it for, the Kama Sutra would teach women on how to make sex more enjoyable, and they would often provide sexual instructions and techniques on how to please their husbands. And it would propose scratching, biting, and including animal noises. And so we wonder whether the animal noises have anything to do with the orgasm, the moaning that is often experienced during orgasm. And so I'd like to put things in perspective here, and if I may tap into the reasons why we see more moaning in women than we do in men. Granted, women do have a lot more nerve endings in the clitoris than men do in the penile glands, that is to say, the head of the penis. But we also wonder whether it is something that women may be able to control. And, well, there are different, there's a wide spectrum as to whether women may be more subtle in their expression or very intense. We wonder if the moaning is because there's a strong physiological response occurring within their body that cannot be contained simply just breathing heavily, or if it's for the purpose of arousing the male more. There have been various studies that have been conducted, and oftentimes women say that they also engage in the practice of faking an orgasm, or if they are hoping that the male would finish soon, they would help by moaning a little bit louder, because they believe that this would stimulate the male to think that he is doing a good job and therefore help him finish faster. So we go back to the Kama Sutra and we say, well, we may not have any Indian background in us as far as we could go back. Nonetheless, there may be some thing or some teachings that may be seen in our expression today. Religion, whether you practice it or not, has been rather influential in our expression of sexuality today. When we look at Christianity, we look at celibacy as the ideal situation where a state of remaining unmarried and of course abstinent would allow an individual to serve the community more. This is one of the reasons why, especially in the Catholic religion, priests are often encouraged not to lie, and in the more conservative and orthodox practices, they would remain celibate. And the reason why is because if they were to be in need of someone perhaps needing assistance at 2 or 3 a.m., not having to care for a family would facilitate that ability to serve. And that's why it is often interpreted as a superior or a desired state. However, chastity was a quality of being sexually pure through abstinence. And this became a virtue, a sign of holiness. As you may already know, holy would mean separated from the rest. And so there are chastity belts that were put in women and in men so that we could prevent them from expressing their sexuality. We also look at the Islam, and we also find that they're a patriarchal society similar to many other religions where they would restrict sexual expression to the marital union exclusively. However, women throughout history have preserved some of the limitation as to what parts of the body are shown to other men. We also see that as we go through the understanding of these religious influences, there is a movement that occurs about 1300 AD, and that is what we know as the Renaissance, and that is also known as rebirth. And this is where women's gains were really at picking up a lot of momentum. Sadly, they were ended abruptly with what became known as witchcraft trials. This basically was a time where thousands of women were killed based on men's fears of women's sexuality. You see, sadly, the thought during this time shifted from God to human beings, and they started focusing a lot more on a sense of joy in life. And the way they would perceive joy in life was by basically doing whatever felt good. And so women who began to view sexuality as more normal, these women were given access to education, and they had a political voice. And when they began to really push forth the idea that women should be able to enjoy this in here, a lot of men were threatened by this in here. And they began to make claims that women who enjoyed sex and who desired that they had to have been possessed by some form of demon. And during this time where religion was much more influential than it is today, it was not difficult to convince the judges that women who were very, very sexually aggressive and promiscuous had to have been possessed by a demon and therefore should be killed because it was not safe for everyone. So sadly, the women who were making advances and in terms of expressing their sexuality and enjoying their sexuality were silenced permanently for a while. In the early 1800s, the Victorian era, we find that public behavior was considered to be a very good way to tell whether a person was classy or not. And because of that, that's where we started separating the classy people, which became known as the bougie or the bourgeois, the upper class, and the not so classy people. And so the more conservative sexual attitudes were of the mindset that sexual stuff should never be spoken outside of the marital bed. This included doctors, and so women sadly would not be allowed to express this to an OBGYN if they ever had some difficulties. So if you ever have a problem, then you speak of that with your husband and nowhere else. If you ever speak to anyone else about sex, then you are considered lower class or ghetto or not so bougie. And so the preoccupation with sex, they said, would interfere with higher achievements. And so anyone who would be just limited to sex would really not be among the brightest or the most respected. Male chivalry was considered to be a good trait, and women were considered to be dependent on men, raising the status and the importance of men even more so. And they would often teach women and repress them in various ways. They would not be allowed to practice any instrument per se. Women who played, for example, the flute or the saxophone or the trumpet would be viewed as promiscuous because they would say that in their behaviors, such as putting an instrument in their mouth, they would be inviting men to sexual stuff. Playing the cello that is held in between your legs would have also been a very, very telling act, and not necessarily a profitable one. It would be one of ghetto, of low class, because you would have your legs open and you would be inviting men to engage in sexual intercourse. So the Victorian era was at that point in which they started setting some interesting norms as to what was acceptable and what was not. You can see that one of the many ways that they used to control these desires that were so natural is in the late 19th century and 20th centuries. A lot of doctors taught that masturbation was terrible, harmful, and it could bring about a lot of mental illness and even blindness and hairy palms. So there were several devices that were created so that boys could be kept from achieving these unwanted erections. So basically, the one that we see here, the one on the left, you may be able to see, these were what we called barbed rings that would be placed in the penile shaft when the penis was flaccid, and if the boy ever became aroused and then the penis engorged with blood, the increase in size would be quickly basically tormented by these spikes that right here, and this would send a message to the boy that he shouldn't engage in this in here. The one on the right in here is what became known as a shock box. This was more modern. There was actually electrical shocks that would be sent to individuals who were engaging or experiencing some type of arousal. As we look at sex in our history, in the American history, we find that our country was founded based on oppression from the British. And so the colonies that became known as the Puritan ethic in the 1600s, they became known as the Puritans. They were basically a religious group who fled from England, and because they were being oppressed in various ways. Sexuality was just one of the ways. But when they established themselves as a society in the New World, they tried to set up a more sound and more accepting form of expression when it came down to sexuality and many other forms. Nonetheless, they would still adhere to the biblical teachings. And whereas in England, there were severe sanctions for engaging in any form of sexual transgressions, the Puritans said, look, we will be a little bit more forgiving on several things, but you would still be put to death if you ever got caught in any form of adultery or rape or bestiality or sodomy. Those were still heavily sanctioned by the Puritans. Again, they would allow for a little bit more than in England they would. For example, they would engage in bundling for young, and that basically was among couples that were courting and young people. They would sometimes allow for them to perhaps share a room, but they would have to bundle themselves up with different layers of clothing. That is, so that they would not have the ease of stripping naked easily and then engaging in sexual intercourse. Unmarried couples would be allowed again to share a bed as long as there was a wooden board or hanging sheets in the middle of the bed, or again wrapping the body in tight clothes so that sex was not easily practiced. So while they were a little bit more forgiving and tolerating mild sexual transgressions, for example, they would say, okay, it's okay for people to have sex in non-missionary sexual positions. For a long time, that was the only acceptable way to express your sexuality. You could have done it in another way, but you could have faced the death penalty if you dared to practice another position. And so they began to view sexuality as natural within the marriage and a little bit more accepting. Nonetheless, again, there were still restrictions. Some of the chapters that Americans are often not proud of is how our freedom was shadowed by the slavery that was also practiced in the New World. Slavery in the 1700s was not unusual, more particularly in the South, but it was seen in different parts of our nation. And what we find is that there were different types of slaves. There were female indentured servants, and basically indentured servants were those people that were bound to work for another person for a specified time in exchange for payment of travel or living expenses. And so oftentimes, because they were in transition, uh, they were commonly raped. This was very difficult on the individual, as the raped and the slave individual, for various reasons. There were no laws that would protect them at all. And basically, the individual that temporarily held them or owned them, as some would say, had the ultimate say. They were a property of that individual. So it was oftentimes difficult for these slaves to be treated as humans, and you could imagine the morale being so low among these individuals. There were several individuals that were affected by these type of sexual interactions that would exist between the indentured servants and the slave owners, because there were people that were being born that would be considered biracial. And this was problematic because, to a certain extent, it would bring about shame to the slave owner if, for example, the son had raped a slave and now there was a child there that was apparently, because of the physical appearance, not entirely of a black race. Now they would be mixed. And as a result of that, there were several people, especially older men, that fought forth and pushed forth what became known as anti-miscegenation laws. And this eventually forbid sexuality, marriage, or breeding among members of different races. Some people said that it was basically because it brought shame. This is what some people would say is eugenics, the deliberate desire to maintain the race, as some people would say, as pure as possible. Sadly, a lot of the minorities have been oppressed through sexuality. Several individuals in the 1700s who were able to read and write would accuse African slaves of having loose morals and being very similar to animals. And sadly, the way this was done was by being set up. Women were often invited and forced to have sex with other slaves. And the reason why is because they wanted to procreate. If they had children, then that would mean that the owners of the slaves would now have more slaves that they could negotiate with. And so women tended to have children by different fathers, oftentimes not knowing who the father was. And then after a year and a half later, they would have another child and another child. And so sadly, the individuals that would force them to do this, which were the slave owners, would later accuse them of being promiscuous. And this became a myth among them that slaves were highly promiscuous. And this was a myth because one of the things that we find is there were often low rates of sexually transmitted infections among slaves. And if it did occur, again, oftentimes the sexuality was not expressed easily because many of these acts of sexual intercourse where procreation was taking place would be done in public. Oftentimes, several slave owners would witness as the individuals would have sex as if it were to be animals. And so you can imagine that these individuals did not really enjoy the moment. Very important for us to see that in the 19th century, polygamy, celibacy, and Comstock Acts became the most pressing items. In the 1820s, we have what's known as the free love movement. It's not the same as what we saw with the hippies in the 1960s, but this is where they started preaching love, not marriage, and then they said that it should be love that should be the factor that determines whether you should have sex or not. You can see that this is really breaking away from the Puritan views that were started back in the 1600s. The Mormons in the 1800s also announced the practicing of polygamy, and that is to say the ability to marry and have multiple wives. In the 19th century, we also find that the medical model of sexuality basically continued to view women as a person that should not be ruled by her ovaries or by her womb. And so to control for them, they would engage in ovarectomy, which basically was the removal of ovaries to correct any type of masturbation or sexual passion. Because again, women should not be that driven for anything. Also, homosexuality was viewed as an illness, no longer a sin as it was before. So there was a beginning of separation from the church. Nonetheless, Anthony Comstock, an individual that felt very strongly in terms of wanting to preserve the Puritanism, pushed forth and advocated strongly for what eventually became known as the Comstock Act of 1873. This basically kept people from sophisticated contraceptive devices or information for almost 60 years because this particular act prohibited mailing of what they called obscene writings or ads that basically just had some type of contraceptive information, and they would be so offended by it. So it wasn't until the Supreme Court in 1965, from 1863, struck it down, and now the condoms and other stuff could be advertised, but you could see that depending on what part of our country you go to, this may still be an issue. In the 20th century, we looked at sexual crusaders and sexologists who brought forth some light into our studying of sexology. In the early 1900s, there was a movement that became known as the social hygiene movement, and this was the result of several women who were affected by their husbands because their husbands were quite promiscuous before, and now women were being infected by them. And this was a problem because it was bringing about elevated costs at hospitals, and it was considered to be a social issue. So because it was a social issue that affected the pockets of individuals, then there was an interest, and laws were passed where there had to be some blood work done prior to marriage so that we can prevent any of this in here. And so this would bring forth some type of advocacy for sex education in school. And this is really where the beginning starts. In Chapter 2, we'll be talking about Alfred Kinsey and Masters and Johnson and how the scientific pursuit to understand human sexuality was really not an easy road. So we'll be talking about this in here and how their work has helped us demystify sex and make it more respectable to discuss more publicly. Again, that's still a work in progress because data in human sexuality continues to be some of the most underrepresented data that we have available. In the 1920s and 1960s, there were the values and attitudes about sexuality changed significantly. I was talking to one of my mentors who is a historian, and she was explaining to me how the invention of the car really changed the way we express our sexuality. Think about it. A husband would often take maybe an hour and a half to get home, and that's prior to having a car. But then with access to a car, there was now access to a backseat, and not to mention that it was a social status. And so it was easier for them to have an hour to kill. And promiscuity was facilitated by the invention of a car. It's not to say that cars themselves brought it forth. I mean, there was already a desire, and while some may argue that it was cars that basically brought this forth, the majority of people would say that it was not cars really that did this. There was already something in place. You may know of the 1920s as the Jazz Age or the Roaring 20s, where there was a lot more partying going on and a lot more freedom in various ways. 1960s, you may be a little bit more familiar with that, with the hippies and make love and not war. And so we see again that the advertising became more sexualized. The discovery of the antibiotics really revolutionized everything because now you can treat sexually transmitted infections. And so this gave people freedom. Pornography became a lot more acceptable in society. And while some people say that it may not necessarily really lead to individuals wanting to have more sex, and some studies actually show that watching a lot of pornography may keep an individual from having sex. And in any case, we find that it really kind of revolutionized the way we started practicing or expressing sexuality. The development of the contraceptive pill was also huge in the 1960s. We find that the contraceptive pill would take sex away from procreation and take it to recreative purposes, and that had never been seen before. Feminism could be traced back to earlier than the 1900s, but here in the United States, we find that Margaret Sanger was very interested in defying the law, so to speak. That was not really her main motive, but given that the Comstock Act was still in place when she started this movement, it was a violation of the law. Margaret Sanger said, quote, "It is none of society's business what a woman shall do with her body," but, end quote. But it was not really what she was driven to do whatever she wanted. It is believed that Sanger's passion to facilitate information to women started when her mother, at the age of 50, died after 18 pregnancies. She believed that had Anthony Comstock not pushed this act forth, that her mother would have had access to some information that would have possibly saved her life. Also, she then gave way to define the Comstock Act and started publishing birth control literature. This brought about a public outrage by a lot of people. And also, when she was taken to court and for violating the Comstock Act, a lot of people were also already supportive of Margaret Sanger. And so this gave way to what we today know as Planned Parenthood. Eventually, other feminist authors also advocated, and some people say that may have added to Margaret Sanger's agenda. Some people say that the agenda was completely changed because then there was advocacy for lesbianism and also for women to also be entitled to enjoy sex. Remember, prior to that, there was movements to control women through ovarectomies because a woman should not be ruled by her womb. So at this point, also women began to be more vocal and saying, hey, I'm also entitled to enjoying sex. And of course, we end our chapter looking at the gay liberation movement in the May 1900s. Please keep in mind that throughout history, homosexuals have been viewed as perverts that often just prey on youth. In the 1950s and 60s, there used to air ads on radio and on TV where there were these men that would be preying on high school boys, waiting after school for them, offering a ride or a drink on a hot day, only to satisfy their sexual appetites. When in actuality, homosexuality is not the same as pedophilia. There have been a lot of attempts to what some people call find a cure. However, the majority of researchers today believe that this is not an illness, and while there are still people out there that believe that it is, there is no convincing evidence that this would be an illness among individuals. In the 1960s, police raided Stonewall, which was a known gay bar, and for the first time, the gay community resisted. Prior to that, the police would be able to get there, raid them, and then throw them in prison, throw them in jail. But this time, the community fought back, and this gave way to a momentum. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association, that's the APA, removed homosexuality from the DSM, that is the DSM-3. Prior to that, they viewed it as an illness. As of 1973, they said, you know what, we don't have evidence it's an illness, and since the 1970s, it has no longer been considered an illness. The 1970s were known as the golden age of gay liberation, and so there were an increased frequency of gay bathhouses, bars, theater groups, magazines, etc. And sadly, this came to a halt in terms of the advancement of these individuals being able to express themselves In the 1980s, with the AIDS epidemic, the AIDS epidemic really brought forth a scare where a lot of gay men began to die because of the disease. There were a lot of movies, there were a lot of myths. You may remember, if you are perhaps older than 30 or 35 years of age, you may remember Karl Malone and Gary Payton and John Stockton, various other players in the NBA who, when Magic Johnson announced that he was HIV positive, they refused to come out and play with him because they were afraid that if he would sweat and they would have some type of contact, that something would occur. That there was a lot of shaming for individuals who had this in here because it was considered to be a gay man disease. And today, although it is now a federal mandate that same-sex marriage could be practiced throughout the entire country of the United States, there continue to be ongoing gay marriage controversies where the laws and even the clerks continue to act independently or above the law because of their long-held views and beliefs, whether it be religious or cultural. This is a review of everything that we looked at and that you read, but I hope it serves as a purpose for you to see the importance of discussing history. When we look at the religious influence, the different civilizations and how they contributed to our understanding of sexuality, we find that even though we may not be from India or from China or from Greece or Romans or Greeks, we find that there is some influence. And that, to a certain extent, continues to shape our sexuality today. I'd like you to engage in all these thoughts and these questions that I pose to you throughout our lecture, and I want you to think about them critically. Really, just reading about it and memorizing things will not help you much. Instead, finding an application for it would really be beneficial.